The candle went out just as footsteps echoed down the corridor. Elena Ashworth froze in the darkness of the great library, her heart slamming against her ribs. She pressed herself against the tall shelves, clutching a small leather book to her chest, praying the shadows would hide her. If the master of this house found her here, uninvited and alone after midnight, there would be no explanation that could save her. The footsteps grew louder. A door creaked open. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of horse and rain, and a tall figure stepped into the room, pulling off his riding gloves one finger at a time. Elena did not breathe. For a moment, she thought he might simply cross the room and leave through the far door without noticing her at all. But then he stopped. He turned his head slowly, and though the room was dim, she felt his eyes find her exactly where she stood. Duke Nathaniel Blackwood said nothing at first. He simply stared at the woman standing among his family's books, as though she were an apparition conjured from the pages themselves. Then his voice cut through the silence, low and sharp. "Who are you, and why are you in my library?" Elena's mind raced through excuses, but none of them would hold. She was no thief, yet she had entered without permission, and the book in her arms was proof enough of trespass in the eyes of any judge. She lifted her chin, refusing to let her fear show on her face, though her hands trembled behind her back. "I meant no harm, Your Grace," she said. "I was only returning something that did not belong to me." Nathaniel's gaze dropped to the book pressed against her chest. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition that Elena did not understand. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and held out his hand. "Show me." She hesitated only a moment before placing the small volume of poetry into his palm. He opened it with careful fingers, as though it might crumble at his touch, and turned the pages slowly, until he found what he was looking for. His breath caught. There, in the margin beside a poem about longing and lost years, was handwriting Elena knew well, though she had not expected the Duke to recognize it. Nathaniel's fingers traced the faded ink, and for a long moment he seemed to forget she was even in the room. "This was my mother's," he said quietly. "She has been gone 3 years, and I have searched every shelf in this house for this exact book. How did you come to have it?" Elena's throat tightened. She had not meant for the truth to come out this way, in the dead of night, caught like a common criminal. But there was no use hiding now. "My father kept it," she said. "He served this house many years ago, before I was born. When he grew ill last winter, he asked me to bring it back, to return it to the family he once served. I did not know how to approach you properly, so I came at night, hoping to leave it somewhere it would be found and no one would need to know who brought it." Nathaniel studied her face in the candlelight that remained from the dying fire across the room. There was something familiar in her features, though he could not place it. He asked her name, and when she gave it, something in his memory stirred faintly, like a name once heard in childhood and long forgotten. "Ashworth," he repeated. "That name means something to this house, though I confess I do not remember why." Elena said nothing. She did not wish to explain the shame that had followed her family for years, the whispers that had driven her father from his position, and left them with nothing but debt and silence. It was not her place to speak of it, not to the Duke, not in his own library at midnight. Nathaniel closed the book gently and held it out to her again, though she did not expect him to return it. "Keep it for tonight," he said, "but you will come back tomorrow, in daylight, and you will explain to me properly how your father came to have my mother's book, and why you felt you could not simply knock at my door." Elena wanted to refuse. She wanted to disappear into the night and never think of this house again, for every memory of the Blackwood family carried with it the ruin of her father's name. But something in the Duke's voice was not cruel, only curious, and beneath that curiosity she thought she heard something closer to hope. "I will come," she said finally. He nodded once, and for a moment neither of them moved. The fire crackled low in the hearth, and outside the tall windows, rain had begun to fall against the glass. Elena realized she had been holding her breath for what felt like an eternity, and she let it out slowly, careful not to let him see how shaken she truly was. As she turned to leave, gathering her worn shawl around her shoulders, Nathaniel spoke again, his voice quieter now. "Elena Ashworth, I will remember that name." She did not know whether to feel comforted or afraid by the promise in his words. She only knew that walking out of that library felt harder than walking in, for now there was no undoing what had happened. The Duke had seen her, had seen the book, had seen the evidence of a connection between their families that she had spent years trying to bury. Outside, the rain had turned into a steady downpour, and Elena pulled her shawl tighter as she hurried down the gravel path away from the grand house, her thoughts spinning faster than her feet could carry her. She thought of her father, lying weak in their small rented room across the village, unaware that his daughter had just stood face to face with the son of the woman who had once shown him kindness, and the son of the family whose name had also, in some way she still did not fully understand, been tied to his downfall. She reached the small cottage just before dawn, soaked through and shivering, and found her father awake, watching the door with worried eyes. "Did you return it?" he asked, his voice thin with illness. Elena knelt beside his bed and took his hand. "I did," she said. "But father, I must tell you what happened." She recounted the meeting in careful words, watching his face grow pale as she described the Duke, the recognition in his eyes, the questions he had asked. When she finished, her father closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them again, there were tears gathered at the corners. "He remembers nothing of what happened to us," her father said softly. "That is likely a mercy. But if he asks you tomorrow, Elena, you must decide how much of the truth you are willing to give him. Some truths, once spoken, cannot be taken back." Elena did not sleep that night. She sat beside her father's bed, turning over every word the Duke had said, every look that had crossed his face when he recognized his mother's handwriting. She thought of the estate she had once visited as a small child, before the scandal, before the shame, when her father had walked those halls with pride, instead of the weight of disgrace on his shoulders. Tomorrow she would return to that house, not as a thief slipping through shadows, but as a woman summoned to answer for her family's past. She did not know what the Duke intended, whether he sought justice, explanation, or something else entirely. But she knew that whatever waited for her within those library walls, her life would not be quite the same after she walked through its doors again. As the first gray light of morning touched the window, Elena finally allowed herself to close her eyes, though sleep did not come easily. Somewhere across the fields, in a house far grander than anything she had ever called home, the Duke of Blackwood sat awake as well, his mother's book open on his desk, staring at the handwriting that had reopened a wound he thought long closed, and wondering what other secrets the woman named Elena Ashworth might be keeping from him. Morning came too quickly. Elena rose from her chair beside her father's bed, her body stiff and her eyes heavy, and set about preparing what little breakfast their small pantry allowed. She boiled water for tea and cut thin slices from the last loaf of bread, trying to keep her hands steady though her mind kept circling back to the library, to the Duke's voice, to the way his fingers had trembled slightly when he touched his mother's handwriting. Her father watched her from his bed, his eyes following her movements with quiet concern. "You do not have to go," he said. "I could send word that I am too ill to explain myself, and perhaps the Duke will let the matter rest." Elena shook her head as she set a cup of tea on the small table beside him. "He will not let it rest, father. I saw it in his face. He wants answers, and if I do not give them, he may come looking for them himself, and that would be far worse for us both." Her father sighed, a sound heavy with old grief. "Then go," he said, "but guard your words carefully. The Blackwood family was never our enemy. Not truly. It was Edmund Whitmore who destroyed us, and if the Duke does not yet know that name, perhaps it is safer for now that it stays buried." Elena nodded, though the name Edmund Whitmore sat like a stone in her chest. She had heard it whispered in her home for years, always followed by silence, always followed by her father's clenched jaw and her mother's sorrowful eyes before she too had passed. She did not fully understand what Edmund Whitmore had done, only that his lies had cost her father his position, his reputation, and nearly his will to live. She dressed in her best gown, though it was far from fine, mended at the hem and faded at the shoulders, and pinned her hair as neatly as she could manage. She looked at her reflection in the small cracked mirror above the wash basin, and hardly recognized the pale, tired woman staring back at her. The walk to Blackwood Hall felt longer in daylight than it had in darkness. Elena passed fields of wet grass still glistening from the night's rain, and the great house rose before her slowly, its stone walls catching the pale morning sun. She had seen it many times from a distance, had walked its edges as a small child holding her father's hand, but she had never approached its front doors as an invited guest. A housekeeper met her at the entrance, an older woman with sharp eyes and a kind face, who introduced herself as Mrs. Fenwick. She looked Elena over carefully, as though trying to place her, before leading her through wide corridors lined with portraits of stern ancestors and tall windows that let in streams of morning light. "The Duke is expecting you in the library," Mrs. Fenwick said. "He has been there since dawn." Elena's stomach tightened at the words. She followed the housekeeper through the grand halls, her worn shoes silent against the polished floors, until they reached the same tall doors she had slipped through the night before under cover of darkness. Mrs. Fenwick knocked once, then opened the door and stepped aside to let Elena pass. Nathaniel stood by the window, his back to the door, his mother's book resting on the desk beside him. He turned when he heard her enter, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The morning light fell across his face, and Elena saw shadows beneath his eyes, evidence that he too had not slept. "Miss Ashworth," he said finally, "thank you for coming." Elena stepped further into the room, her hands folded tightly in front of her, bracing herself for whatever questions were about to come. "Sit," Nathaniel said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. Elena obeyed, perching on the edge of the seat as though ready to flee at the first sign of danger. He remained standing, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself to hold his gaze. "Tell me about your father," he said. "Tell me how he came to have my mother's book, and why a man who once served this family would send his daughter creeping through my library in the dead of night rather than simply calling at the front door." Elena's fingers twisted in her lap. She had rehearsed careful words on the walkover, words that would explain enough without revealing everything. But now, sitting across from the Duke in the full light of morning, those careful words seemed to slip away from her. "My father served as steward of this estate many years ago," she began. "Before you were master here, when your mother still oversaw the household matters herself. He spoke of her often, of her kindness, her fairness. She gave him that book as a gift one winter, for his service to the family." "And what happened?" Nathaniel pressed. "That he no longer serves this house." Elena hesitated. "There was an accusation," she said finally, "of mismanaging funds meant for the tenant repairs. My father always claimed his innocence, but the evidence against him was strong enough that he was dismissed without recommendation, and no other estate would hire a steward accused of theft. We have lived in poverty since I was a small child." Nathaniel's expression darkened, though not, Elena realized with some relief, in anger toward her. He turned toward the window, his jaw tight, his hands clasped behind his back. "I do not remember this," he said quietly. "I was young when it happened, sent away to school, and my father managed such matters without involving me. I remember only that our steward changed, and that my mother grew quiet for a time afterward, though I never understood why." Elena said nothing, unsure whether to offer comfort or simply let the silence sit between them. Nathaniel turned back to face her, and something in his eyes had shifted, a hardness that had not been there before. "I intend to look into this matter," he said. "If your father was wrongly accused, I would know the truth of it, and if some injustice was done under my family's name, I would see it corrected." Elena's heart quickened, though she was careful not to let hope show too plainly on her face. She had heard such promises before, from lesser men who had no intention of keeping them, and she did not yet know whether the Duke was any different. "Why would you trouble yourself with this?" she asked before she could stop herself. "I am no one to you. My father is no one to you now, whatever he once was." Nathaniel's gaze softened slightly. "Because my mother trusted him enough to give him a gift meant for someone she respected," he said. "And because I do not like the idea that my family's name may have been used to destroy an innocent man while I was away learning Latin and mathematics, blind to what was happening in my own house." Elena did not know how to respond to such honesty. She had expected coldness, perhaps suspicion, but not this quiet determination to right an old wrong. She studied his face, searching for deception, but found none. "There is something else," Nathaniel said, moving to sit in the chair across from her at last. "I find I do not wish for you to simply walk out of this house and disappear back into whatever life you have been living. Your father's situation troubles me, yes, but so does the thought of a woman with clearly some education and grace, spending her days scraping by in poverty because of a wrong committed against her family." Elena stiffened. "I do not want pity, Your Grace." "I am not offering pity," he said firmly. "I am offering employment. This library has fallen into disorder since my mother's passing. I need someone to catalog the collection properly, to restore order to what has become chaos. You clearly have some education, given how carefully you handled that book last night. I am offering you honest work, with fair wages, nothing more." Elena's mind raced. Accepting such a position would mean returning to this house day after day, would mean facing the Duke regularly, would mean risking whatever fragile dignity she had left if the arrangement went wrong or if gossip began to spread about her presence in his household. But she thought of her father, weak and unable to work, of the debts slowly crushing what little they had left, and she knew she could not afford the luxury of pride. "I accept," she said quietly, "but I must be honest with you, Your Grace. I do not know what my father would say if he learned I had taken employment in this house, given everything that happened here." "Then perhaps it is best he does not learn every detail," Nathaniel said, though there was no cruelty in his suggestion, only practicality. "You may tell him you have found honest work. The rest can remain between us until I have learned more of the truth myself." Elena agreed, though unease settled in her stomach at the thought of keeping secrets from her father, who had already suffered so much from secrets and lies told by others. She rose from her chair, and Nathaniel rose as well, extending his hand toward her in a gesture that felt strangely formal given the intimacy of what had just passed between them. "You may begin tomorrow morning," he said. "Mrs. Fenwick will show you where to find everything you need." Elena nodded and turned to leave, but at the door she paused, looking back at him one final time. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, "for not calling the constable last night, and for listening to me this morning." Nathaniel's expression, usually so composed, softened into something almost gentle. "I confess I am glad I did not," he said, though I could not say exactly why. Elena left the library with her heart pounding for reasons she could not fully name, and made her way home through fields now bright with midday sun, her thoughts tangled between relief at securing income for her family and fear of what deeper secrets her new employment might unearth. That evening she told her father only that she had found work at a neighboring estate, cataloging a private library for a generous employer. He seemed pleased, though his eyes lingered on her a moment too long, as though he suspected there was more to the story than she was telling. She busied herself preparing their small supper, avoiding his gaze, grateful when exhaustion finally claimed him and he drifted into an early sleep. Elena sat alone by the dying fire that night, turning over everything the Duke had said. She thought of his promise to investigate her father's dismissal and wondered what he might uncover, and whether the truth, once found, would bring relief or only deeper pain. She thought too of the way his expression had changed when he spoke of his mother, the genuine grief still lingering beneath his composed exterior, and found herself wondering what kind of man Nathaniel Blackwood truly was beneath the title and the grand house and the cold reputation she had always heard whispered about him in the village. Miles away, in his own study, Nathaniel sat before a stack of old estate ledgers he had ordered retrieved from the record room, determined to find whatever evidence remained of the accusation against Harold Ashworth. He worked late into the night, candle burning low, his mind circling not only around the mystery of the old scandal, but around the woman who had walked so unexpectedly into his library and, it seemed, into thoughts he had not entertained in a very long time. As he searched through pages of faded handwriting and old financial records, one name kept appearing again and again in the margins of the ledgers, a name attached to signatures and approvals that should not have belonged there. Edmund Whitmore, listed not as a mere witness to the accusations against Ashworth, but as the very man who had first brought the charges forward, and who had, curiously, taken over management of several tenant contracts almost immediately after Ashworth's dismissal. Nathaniel sat back in his chair, a slow and uncomfortable realization dawning on him. Edmund Whitmore was his own cousin, a man he had known his entire life, a man who now stood to inherit the Blackwood title and estate, should Nathaniel remain unmarried past the coming autumn deadline set by his late father's will. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit, and he closed the ledger slowly, aware that whatever truth he uncovered in the coming days might reach far closer to home than he had ever anticipated. He did not sleep that night either. Instead, he paced the length of his study, turning the discovery over in his mind again and again, searching for some innocent explanation that would clear his cousin's name. Edmund had always been ambitious, quick with a clever word, and quicker still with a charming smile. But Nathaniel had never once suspected him of deliberate cruelty. Surely there was some mistake in the ledgers, some detail he had misread in his exhaustion. Yet the more he studied the pages, the clearer the pattern became. Edmund had not merely witnessed the accusation against Harold Ashworth. He had built it, piece by piece, presenting forged receipts and false testimony from tenants who, Nathaniel now suspected, had been paid or threatened into silence. Within a month of Ashworth's dismissal, Edmund had positioned himself as an advisor to Nathaniel's father, gradually gaining influence over estate matters that had once belonged to the honest steward he had destroyed. By the time morning arrived, Nathaniel had made a decision. He would not confront Edmund yet, not until he had gathered enough proof to leave no room for denial or clever excuses. He would proceed carefully, continuing his search through the old records while keeping his suspicions hidden, and in the meantime, he would ensure that Elena Ashworth had every reason to trust that her family's name would eventually be restored. When Elena arrived at Blackwood Hall the following morning, she found the library transformed from the quiet, shadowed room she remembered into a space filled with soft daylight streaming through freshly opened curtains. Mrs. Fenwick greeted her warmly this time, without the guarded curiosity of the day before, and led her to a long table where stacks of uncatalogued books waited in towering, disorganized piles. "The Duke wishes for everything to be sorted by subject and author," Mrs. Fenwick explained, handing Elena a ledger book and a set of quills. "He says you are to work at your own pace, though I suspect he will be checking on your progress more often than he lets on." Elena caught the faint amusement in the housekeeper's voice and wondered what exactly Mrs. Fenwick suspected about her employer's sudden interest in library organization. She said nothing, only nodded and set to work, grateful for the honest labor and the quiet dignity of a task that required focus rather than explanation. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither Elena nor Nathaniel had quite expected. She arrived each morning, worked steadily through the towering stacks of books, and found herself, more often than she anticipated, interrupted by the Duke himself, who claimed to be searching for some particular volume but who lingered far longer than any search required. Their conversations, at first stiff and formal, gradually loosened into something easier, filled with shared opinions about poetry and history, and occasional laughter that surprised them both with how naturally it came. Elena learned that Nathaniel had lost his mother to illness 3 years earlier, and his father the year before that, leaving him to manage the estate and title far younger than he had anticipated. He learned that Elena had cared for her ailing father alone since her mother's death, taking on quiet work wherever she could find it, always careful to protect what remained of her family's dignity. Neither spoke of the deeper mystery unfolding beneath their growing friendship, though both carried it with them into every conversation. Every glance held a moment too long. One afternoon, as autumn light slanted gold through the tall windows, Elena found herself laughing freely at something Nathaniel had said, a rare, unguarded sound that seemed to surprise them both. He watched her with an expression she could not quite name, something warmer than curiosity, something that made her pulse quicken and her cheeks flush with a heat she quickly tried to hide by returning her attention to the books before her. "You should laugh more often," Nathaniel said quietly. "It suits you." Elena did not know how to respond to such a simple, disarming compliment, and for a moment the air between them felt charged with something neither of them dared to name aloud. She busied her hands with the ledger, grateful for the excuse to look away, though she could still feel his gaze lingering on her a moment longer before he finally turned and left the room, leaving her alone with her racing heart and a growing, unsettling awareness that her feelings toward the Duke of Blackwood had become far more complicated than simple gratitude for honest employment. That night, walking home beneath a sky scattered with early stars, Elena found herself smiling without quite meaning to, replaying the small moments of the day, the sound of his laughter, the way his expression softened when he spoke of his mother. She scolded herself silently for allowing such thoughts to take root, reminding herself of the gulf that stood between a duke and a steward's disgraced daughter, yet the smile lingered all the same, stubborn and quiet, all the way to her father's door. A carriage rattled up the drive of Blackwood Hall 3 weeks after Elena had begun her work in the library, and its arrival sent a ripple of unease through the household that Elena felt before she even saw who had come. "Edmund Whitmore," Mrs. Fenwick murmured as she passed through the library with an armful of linens, her voice carrying a note of caution that made Elena look up from her work. Elena watched through the tall windows as a well-dressed man stepped down from the carriage, his coat cut in the latest fashion, his smile broad and easy as he greeted the footman who came to take his bags. Something about his manner unsettled her immediately, though she could not name why. There was a smoothness to him, a practiced charm that reminded her uncomfortably of merchants who sold goods they knew to be faulty while smiling all the while. She did not have long to wonder about him. Within the hour, Nathaniel appeared in the library doorway, his expression carefully composed but his shoulders tense in a way Elena had come to recognize over their weeks of quiet companionship. "My cousin has arrived unannounced," he said. "He does this often, claiming family obligation requires his presence, though I suspect he simply enjoys reminding me that he waits eagerly for the day I fail to marry before the year is out." Elena's stomach tightened at the mention of the name that had haunted her family for years, though she said nothing, uncertain how much Nathaniel yet knew of the connection between his cousin and her father's ruin. She had noticed, in recent days, that Nathaniel seemed to be working late into the evenings on some private matter, often summoning old estate records from the archive room, though he had not spoken to her directly about what he searched for. "I would prefer you avoid him if possible," Nathaniel continued, his voice lower now, almost protective in its urgency. "He can be charming, but he is not a man to be trusted, and I would not have him take any particular interest in you." Elena wanted to ask why, wanted to know how much Nathaniel suspected, but the sound of footsteps in the corridor silenced her question before she could voice it. Edmund Whitmore appeared in the doorway a moment later, his sharp eyes sweeping across the room and landing, with obvious curiosity, on Elena. "Cousin," he said smoothly, stepping into the library with an easy confidence that filled the room. "I did not realize you had taken on new staff. She is lovely. Wherever did you find her?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Ashworth is cataloging the library collection," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "She has proven quite capable." "Ashworth," Edmund repeated, and for a fraction of a second something flickered behind his eyes, gone so quickly that Elena almost believed she had imagined it. "What an unusual name. I feel I have heard it somewhere before, though I cannot place where." Elena kept her expression still through sheer force of will, though her heart pounded painfully against her ribs. She excused herself as politely as she could manage, gathering an armful of books as pretense to leave the room, and did not miss the way Edmund's gaze followed her all the way to the door. That evening, after Elena had gone home and the house had settled into its usual quiet, Nathaniel confronted Edmund directly in the drawing room, watching his cousin's face carefully as he raised the subject of old estate records and a steward dismissed many years before. "I have been reviewing the old ledgers," Nathaniel said, keeping his voice light, conversational, though every word was chosen with careful precision. "Strange discrepancies in the accounts from around the time our former steward, Harold Ashworth, was dismissed. I wondered if you remembered anything of the matter, given you were often at the estate during those years." Edmund's smile did not waver, though his eyes grew slightly more guarded. "That was long ago, cousin," he said. "I remember only that the man was found stealing from the tenant repair funds. A shameful business, but hardly worth revisiting after so many years." "And yet you remember it clearly enough," Nathaniel observed, watching his cousin's composure with growing suspicion, "for a matter you claim was so long ago and so unremarkable." Edmund's laugh came a beat too late, a beat too forced. "You always did have a sharp memory for details, cousin," he said, rising from his chair with practiced ease. "But I confess I am tired from my journey. Perhaps we can discuss old business another evening." He left the room before Nathaniel could press further, and Nathaniel sat alone in the dim light of the drawing room, more convinced than ever that his cousin's discomfort was not the discomfort of an innocent man recalling an unpleasant memory, but the discomfort of a guilty one caught unexpectedly close to exposure. Over the following days, Edmund's presence in the house grew increasingly unwelcome to Elena. She noticed him watching her during meals she occasionally shared with the household staff, noticed him lingering near the library doorway when he thought no one observed him, his expression thoughtful in a way that made her skin prickle with unease. She said nothing to Nathaniel of these small observations, not wishing to seem foolish or overly cautious, but she began arriving earlier and leaving later, timing her comings and goings to avoid Edmund's schedule as much as possible. One afternoon, as Elena worked alone in the library, sorting through a collection of old family correspondence Nathaniel had asked her to organize, Edmund appeared in the doorway without warning, his usual easy smile firmly in place. "Miss Ashworth," he said, stepping into the room uninvited. "I find myself curious about you. My cousin seems remarkably protective of a mere librarian's assistant. One might almost think there was some other reason for your presence here." Elena kept her eyes on the papers before her hands steady despite the unease coiling in her stomach. "I am simply grateful for honest work, sir," she said carefully, "nothing more." Edmund moved closer, studying her with an intensity that made her want to step back, though she held her ground. "Ashworth," he said again, as though testing the sound of the name on his tongue. "I have been trying to recall where I have heard it before. Perhaps you could enlighten me. Did your father ever work in service to a great house?" Elena's blood ran cold, though she forced her expression to remain neutral. "My father was a steward once," she said, choosing her words with great care. "Though that was many years ago, before circumstances changed our family's fortunes." Something shifted in Edmund's expression, a flicker of calculation that vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced once more by his easy, practiced charm. "How fascinating," he said. "Small world, is it not, that fate should bring you here of all places?" He left the room without further explanation, but Elena sat frozen at the table for several long minutes afterward, her heart racing, certain now that Edmund Whitmore knew exactly who she was, and exactly what his own hand had done to destroy her family so many years before. She did not know what to do with this certainty, whether to warn Nathaniel of her suspicions or to remain silent and risk whatever game Edmund seemed determined to play. She chose in the end to tell Nathaniel everything, finding him later that evening in his study, still surrounded by old ledgers and estate papers. He listened carefully as she recounted the conversation, his expression growing darker with each detail, his hands clenched tightly on the edge of his desk. "He knows," Nathaniel said quietly when she finished. He knows who you are, and he knows I have been searching through the old records. This changes things. He will grow careful now, will try to cover whatever traces remain of his involvement. What did he do? Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Nathaniel hesitated only a moment before sliding a stack of papers across the desk toward her. I have found evidence, he said. Forged receipts, false witness statements, records that show Edmund himself brought the accusations against your father and profited handsomely from his dismissal by taking over contracts your father once managed. I believe your father was entirely innocent, Elena. I believe my cousin destroyed him deliberately, to gain influence over this estate and perhaps, even then, to position himself closer to inheriting what he could not otherwise claim. Elena's hands trembled as she looked through the papers, years of her father's suffering laid bare in the careful, damning evidence Nathaniel had gathered. Tears gathered in her eyes, tears of vindication and grief mixed together, and she pressed a hand to her mouth to steady herself. Why? She whispered. Why would he do something so cruel to a man who had done him no wrong? Because power and greed rarely require reason, Nathaniel said gently, moving around the desk to stand beside her. Because my cousin has always resented standing second in line for a title and estate he believes should have been his by merit rather than birth order, and because destroying a capable, honest steward cleared his path toward influence over this family's affairs far more easily than any legitimate effort could have. Elena set the papers down carefully, overwhelmed by the weight of truth finally given voice after so many years of silence and shame. What happens now? She asked. Now I gather enough proof to expose him completely, Nathaniel said, his voice firm with resolve. And I make certain your father's name is restored publicly, before the same society that once condemned him without cause. But Elena, I must ask you to be patient a little longer, and to be careful. Edmund is dangerous when cornered, and I do not yet have everything I need to bring him down completely. Elena nodded, though fear still coiled tightly in her chest. She thought of her father, weak and unaware of how close the truth had come to finally surfacing after all these years, and she thought of Edmund Whitmore's calculating eyes studying her in the library, and she wondered, with growing dread, what lengths a desperate man might go to protect a secret capable of destroying everything he had built. Nathaniel reached out and took her hand gently, a gesture that surprised them both with its tenderness. Whatever happens, he said quietly, I will not let him harm you or your father further. I promise you that. Elena looked up into his eyes, finding there a sincerity that steadied her racing heart, even as uncertainty about the days ahead pressed heavily upon her. She did not pull her hand away, and for a long, quiet moment, the weight of old scandal and present danger seemed to fade beneath something warmer, something neither of them was yet ready to name, but which both, in that quiet study lit only by candlelight, felt growing steadily between them. Before Elena left the house that night, Mrs. Fenwick caught her in the corridor, drawing her gently into a small sitting room away from prying ears. The older woman's face was lined with concern, and she spoke in a low voice, as though the very walls of Blackwood Hall might carry her words to unwelcome listeners. I served this house when your father was steward, child, Mrs. Fenwick said. I remember him well. A fair man, patient with the tenants, careful with the accounts. I never believed the accusations against him, though I had no proof to offer at the time, and no standing to speak against a man like Edmund Whitmore, even then a favorite of the old Duke's approval. Elena's eyes filled with unexpected tears at hearing her father spoken of with such warmth by someone who had known him before disgrace had swallowed his good name. Why did no one speak for him? She asked softly. Mrs. Fenwick's expression turned sorrowful. Fear, mostly, she admitted. Edmund was clever even as a young man, always finding ways to make those who doubted him regret their doubt. 2 tenants who might have spoken in your father's defense suddenly found their leases in jeopardy. A stable hand who questioned the receipts was dismissed within the week, for unrelated reasons that seemed, to those of us watching, entirely invented. It was easier, and safer, for most to simply stay silent and let the matter pass. Elena absorbed this with a heavy heart, understanding now the full scope of the cruelty that had been used against her family. Not merely false accusation, but a deliberate campaign to silence anyone who might have offered her father protection. She thanked Mrs. Fenwick for her honesty and made her way out into the cool evening air, her mind heavy with everything she had learned. She did not get far down the gravel path before a voice called out behind her, smooth and unhurried, sending a fresh wave of unease through her body. Miss Ashworth, walking home alone at this hour seems unwise. Elena turned to find Edmund Whitmore standing several paces behind her, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his expression unreadable in the fading light. She kept her voice steady, though her pulse raced. "I have walked this path many times, sir. I am quite capable of finding my own way." "Of course," Edmund said, stepping closer despite her clear wish for distance. "I only thought we might speak plainly, you and I, without my cousin's presence to complicate matters. I know who you are, Elena. I know whose daughter you are. I imagine my cousin has been sharing certain old records with you, records that paint an unflattering picture of my past conduct." Elena said nothing, unwilling to confirm or deny anything that might be used against Nathaniel or herself. Edmund's smile thinned, losing its practiced warmth, revealing something colder beneath. "Let me offer you some honest advice," he continued. "Whatever my cousin has promised you, whatever fine sentiments he has whispered in that library of his, consider carefully what will happen to you when his interest fades, as it inevitably will. A duke does not marry a disgraced steward's daughter, however charming she may prove herself over a season of shared books and quiet conversation. You would do well to take whatever coin you can from this arrangement and disappear quietly, before matters grow more complicated than you are prepared to handle." Elena's chin lifted, anger overtaking her fear. "Is that a threat, sir?" Edmund's expression remained maddeningly calm. "It is friendly counsel," he said, "from one who understands how quickly reputations can be destroyed, and how little proof is truly required to accomplish it. Good evening, Miss Ashworth. Do walk safely home." He turned and strode back toward the house, leaving Elena standing alone on the darkening path, her hands trembling with a mixture of fury and fear she had not expected to feel so acutely. She hurried the rest of the way home, casting glances over her shoulder more than once, and did not fully calm herself until she had bolted the small cottage door behind her, and found her father sleeping peacefully, unaware of the danger now circling ever closer to the fragile new life his daughter had begun to build. That night Elena resolved to tell Nathaniel everything at first light, understanding now with painful clarity that Edmund Whitmore would not simply allow the truth to surface without a fight, and that whatever quiet happiness she had begun to feel within the walls of Blackwood Hall now stood threatened by a man both clever and utterly without conscience. She lay awake long past midnight, listening to the wind press against the shutters, turning Edmund's words over in her mind. He had not merely warned her away out of concern for propriety. There had been something desperate beneath his calm delivery, something that told her he understood exactly how close Nathaniel had come to uncovering the full truth. A desperate man, she knew, was far more dangerous than a confident one, for desperation made him unpredictable, willing to risk more than caution would normally allow. She thought of her father sleeping just beyond the thin wall separating their two small rooms, still unaware of how directly the past had returned to reach for them both. She thought of Nathaniel's hand closing gently over hers in the candlelit study, the warmth of that touch lingering even now, hours later, like an ember refusing to fade. Whatever grew between them, however impossible Edmund insisted it must remain, Elena found she was no longer willing to simply disappear quietly as he had suggested. She rose before dawn, dressed quickly, and set out for Blackwood Hall, while the sky was still gray with early light, determined to reach Nathaniel before Edmund could shape the coming day to his own advantage. The path felt different in the pale morning quiet, familiar now after weeks of walking it, though her heart beat with a new and urgent purpose that had not been there before. Whatever battle lay ahead, she resolved to face it standing beside Nathaniel rather than fleeing from it, however much safer flight might have seemed. Whispers reached Elena before she even stepped through the front doors of Blackwood Hall that morning, carried on the lips of two maids polishing silver in the entrance hall who fell silent the instant they noticed her, their eyes darting away with poorly hidden embarrassment. Elena's stomach tightened, but she said nothing, continuing on toward the library with her chin held high, refusing to let their sudden silence unsettle her further than the sleepless night already had. She found Nathaniel waiting for her there, his expression grim, a folded letter clutched in his hand. "Someone has been talking," he said without preamble. "A letter arrived this morning addressed to several families in the county, describing you as a scheming woman who seduced her way into my household through deception, claiming false ties to old family history, secure both employment and my personal attention." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. "Edmund," she whispered. Nathaniel nodded grimly. "I cannot yet prove it came from his hand directly, though the timing leaves little doubt. He warned you last night, and this morning half the county believes you are nothing more than a fortune hunter preying on a grieving duke." Elena sank into the nearest chair, her earlier resolve wavering under the sudden weight of public shame she had not anticipated so soon. "I told you he was dangerous," she said quietly. "I did not think he would move so quickly, or so publicly." "He wishes to force our hand," Nathaniel said, pacing the length of the room with barely contained anger. He knows I have been gathering evidence against him, and he hopes that by discrediting you so thoroughly, he can discredit whatever claims I eventually bring forward on your father's behalf. If the daughter is painted as a liar and schemer, who will believe the father was ever innocent? The following days brought a steady stream of small cruelties that wore at Elena's resolve more sharply than she had expected. Invitations to household gatherings that had once included her now quietly stopped arriving. Villagers who had once greeted her warmly at market now offered only stiff nods before hurrying past. Even Mrs. Fenwick, though she remained kind and steadfast in private, warned Elena that some of the younger staff had begun repeating unkind rumors below stairs, emboldened by the letters now circulating among the local gentry. Elena bore it as best she could, continuing her work in the library each day with quiet determination, though the strain showed plainly in the shadows beneath her eyes and the careful, guarded way she now moved through the halls of Blackwood Hall. Nathaniel watched her suffer under the weight of his cousin's cruelty with growing fury, and though he tried to shield her wherever possible, he could not undo whispers already spreading through drawing rooms across the county. One evening, as autumn rain drummed steadily against the library windows, Elena found herself unable to maintain her composure any longer. She set down the book she had been pretending to catalog and pressed her palms against her tired eyes, exhaustion and humiliation finally overwhelming her careful control. "Perhaps I should simply leave," she said quietly, more to herself than to Nathaniel, who stood near the fireplace watching her with quiet concern. Perhaps that would end this more quickly than continuing to fight against something so much larger than either of us. Nathaniel crossed the room swiftly and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his with an urgency that surprised them both. "Do not say that," he said firmly. "Do not let him win simply because he has more practice at cruelty than either of us has at defending against it." Elena looked up at him, tears gathering despite her efforts to hold them back. "I am tired, Nathaniel," she admitted, using his given name for the first time, the intimacy of it startling them both into a brief, charged silence. "I am tired of fighting battles that were never mine to begin with, inherited from a scandal I did not create, carried forward by a man who seems determined to destroy whatever small happiness I manage to find." Nathaniel reached up and gently brushed a tear from her cheek, his touch lingering longer than propriety strictly allowed. "Then let me carry some of that weight," he said softly. "You are not fighting alone, Elena. Whatever Edmund believes he can accomplish through whispers and lies, he has not yet accounted for how far I am willing to go to protect what I have come to care for so deeply." The words hung between them, heavier with meaning than either had yet dared to speak aloud. Elena searched his face, finding there none of the practiced charm that made Edmund's words feel so hollow, only quiet, steady sincerity that reached something deep and long guarded within her. "I care for you as well," she whispered finally, the confession costing her something precious to speak, given everything she stood to lose should it prove misplaced trust. "More than I believed wise to allow myself, given everything that stands between us." Nathaniel's expression softened into something Elena had never seen there before, a gentleness that made her breath catch in her throat. "Let the world worry about what stands between us," he said. "I find I care far more about what might grow between us, given the chance." He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but Elena did not move, and when his lips finally met hers, soft and searching, she felt weeks of fear and exhaustion dissolve into something warm and steady and entirely unexpected. The kiss was brief, careful, filled with restraint on both their parts, but it left Elena breathless nonetheless, her hand rising instinctively to rest against his chest, as though to steady herself against the sudden shift in everything she had believed possible between them. When they finally parted, Nathaniel rested his forehead gently against hers, both of them breathing unsteadily in the quiet, rain-soaked evening. "Whatever Edmund throws against us," he murmured, "we will face it together from this point forward. I will not let him drive you away, Elena, not now." Elena closed her eyes, allowing herself, for just a moment, to believe that such a promise might actually hold against the storm still gathering around them. But even as she leaned into the warmth of his embrace, a small, cautious voice in the back of her mind reminded her that Edmund Whitmore had not yet played his final card, and that a man so willing to destroy an innocent steward years ago would hardly hesitate to escalate further, should quiet rumors prove insufficient to achieve his aims. News of the growing attachment between the Duke and his librarian's assistant spread through the county almost as quickly as Edmund's earlier letters had, though this time the rumors carried a different tone, curious rather than accusatory among those who had not yet been poisoned entirely against Elena's character. Some among the local gentry found the story rather romantic, whispering excitedly about the disgraced steward's daughter who had somehow captured the heart of the reclusive young duke. Others, particularly those who owed favors or loyalty to Edmund Whitmore, grew louder in their condemnation, painting Elena as calculating and Nathaniel as dangerously naive. Edmund himself watched these developments with carefully concealed alarm, understanding that his earlier attempt to discredit Elena had failed to achieve its intended effect, and had instead, in some circles, only deepened public fascination with the unlikely romance blooming within Blackwood Hall. He retreated to his rooms for several days, emerging only for meals, his usual easy charm replaced by a simmering tension that even the household staff noticed and quietly discussed among themselves. Nathaniel, sensing his cousin's retreat as merely a pause before some more decisive action, redoubled his efforts to gather conclusive proof of Edmund's involvement in Harold Ashworth's ruin. He sent trusted men to interview the tenants Mrs. Fenwick had mentioned, those who had once been threatened into silence, hoping that enough time had passed for old fears to soften into willingness to finally speak the truth. Slowly, carefully, testimony began to accumulate. An elderly tenant, now retired and living comfortably on land far from Edmund's influence, agreed to sign a written statement confirming that his lease had indeed been threatened decades earlier should he speak in Harold Ashworth's defense. A former stable hand, now employed at a distant estate, provided similar testimony, describing his sudden dismissal on invented grounds shortly after questioning the accuracy of certain financial receipts. Nathaniel gathered each piece of evidence with growing confidence, aware that he was building not merely a case for Elena's father's innocence, but an undeniable record of his cousin's calculated cruelty, one that would leave Edmund no room for the smooth denials and charming deflections that had served him so well for so many years. At home, Elena finally found the courage to tell her father the truth of everything that had unfolded since the night she had crept into Blackwood Hall's library with his old poetry book pressed against her chest. She sat beside his bed one quiet evening, holding his weathered hand, and recounted it all: the Duke's recognition of his mother's handwriting, the offer of employment, the slow uncovering of Edmund Whitmore's role in his ruin, and finally, hesitantly, the growing affection that had blossomed between herself and Nathaniel despite every obstacle standing against it. Her father listened in silence, his expression shifting through surprise, sorrow, and finally something that looked almost like cautious hope. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling as though gathering scattered thoughts from years long past. "I always believed Edmund Whitmore capable of such cruelty," he said finally, his voice thin but steady. "I simply had no proof, and no strength left to fight a battle I could not win alone. If the Duke has truly found evidence of what was done to me, Elena, then perhaps these years of shame were not entirely wasted, if they lead now to the truth finally being told." Elena squeezed his hand gently, tears gathering in her eyes. "I am frightened, father," she admitted. "Edmund grows more desperate each day, and I fear what he might attempt next, now that whispers and rumors alone have failed to drive me away." Her father's grip tightened weakly around her fingers. "Be careful, my daughter," he said. "A cornered man is far more dangerous than a confident one. Trust the Duke's judgment, but trust your own instincts as well. If something feels wrong, do not dismiss it simply because it seems too cautious." Elena carried his warning with her in the days that followed, growing increasingly watchful of Edmund's movements around the estate, though he remained largely secluded, emerging only briefly for meals before retreating once more to whatever schemes occupied him behind closed doors. She noticed, however, that he had begun corresponding frequently with someone outside the household, sealed letters carried away by a messenger who arrived and departed with unusual regularity, always at odd hours when most of the household slept. She mentioned this to Nathaniel one afternoon as they worked together in the library, now more often side by side than separated by careful formality, their earlier restraint gradually softening into easy companionship, punctuated by stolen glances and lingering touches neither of them tried very hard to hide anymore. "He is planning something," Nathaniel agreed, his brow furrowed with concern. "I have my own suspicions about who he might be corresponding with, given certain business dealings I discovered while reviewing the old estate records. There was a solicitor involved in the original accusations against your father, a man named Percival Grant, who conveniently profited from handling the legal aspects of the dismissal. If Edmund fears exposure, he may be seeking to strengthen whatever false documentation still exists, or worse, seeking to silence witnesses before they can testify against him." Elena's blood ran cold at the thought. "The tenant," she said, "the stable hand. If Edmund learns they have spoken against him." Nathaniel's expression darkened further. I have already sent word ensuring their safety, he assured her, though worry remained plain in his voice. But I do not underestimate my cousin's resourcefulness, Elena. We must move more quickly than I had originally planned. I intend to present what evidence I have gathered before the assembled county at the harvest gathering next month, when enough witnesses and respected families will be present to make any denial from Edmund appear as transparent as it truly is. Elena nodded, though anxiety coiled tightly in her chest at the thought of such a public confrontation, aware that Edmund would not simply accept exposure without a final, desperate attempt to protect himself, whatever form that attempt might take. She trusted Nathaniel's judgment, trusted the careful, methodical way he had built his case, but her father's warning echoed persistently in her thoughts, reminding her that a cornered man rarely fought fairly, and that the coming weeks would likely test the fragile happiness she and Nathaniel had only just begun to claim for themselves. That night, as she walked home beneath a sky heavy with clouds threatening more rain, Elena found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once, half convinced she heard footsteps trailing somewhere behind her in the darkness. She told herself it was only nerves, only the natural unease that came with knowing a dangerous man now understood precisely how close he stood to losing everything he had built on the foundation of another man's ruin. Still, she quickened her pace, relief flooding through her only once the small cottage came into view, its single-lit window glowing warm against the gathering storm. Inside, she found her father awake, waiting for her with a cup of tea already prepared, his weathered face creased with the particular concern of a parent who sensed trouble without needing it fully explained. She sat beside him, grateful for the quiet comfort of his presence, and did not mention the footsteps she thought she had heard, not wishing to burden him further with fears she could not yet confirm. But she resolved, quietly and firmly, to speak with Nathaniel the very next morning about arranging safer passage between the estate and her home, understanding now that the coming weeks would demand caution at every turn, however inconvenient such caution might prove. A messenger arrived at Blackwood Hall at dawn, breathless and pale, carrying news that shattered whatever fragile peace Elena and Nathaniel had managed to build over the preceding weeks. The tenant who had agreed to testify, an elderly man named Walter Higgins, had been found unconscious outside his cottage the previous night, his home ransacked, his written statement missing entirely from where he had kept it locked away for safekeeping. He was alive, though badly shaken and unable to recall clearly what had happened, only that a stranger had come asking questions before the attack, and that he now feared for his safety should he attempt to speak against Edmund Whitmore again. Nathaniel read the messenger's report with barely controlled fury, his hands trembling with rage he fought hard to contain. Elena stood beside him, her own face pale with shock and fear, understanding immediately what this meant. Edmund had moved from whispers and rumors to something far more dangerous, and there would be no undoing whatever violence he was now willing to commit to protect his secrets. He grows desperate, Nathaniel said, his voice tight, which means he grows careless as well. We must act now, before he silences the stable hand too, before he destroys whatever remaining evidence we have not yet secured. But even as Nathaniel prepared to ride out and confirm the safety of their remaining witness, a far more devastating blow arrived that same afternoon, delivered by Edmund himself with a calm, satisfied smile that chilled Elena to her core the moment she saw it. He requested a private audience with Nathaniel in the drawing room, and insisted, with pointed cruelty, that Elena remain present as well. He carried with him a leather folder, which he set upon the table between them with the deliberate care of a man revealing a winning hand at cards. "I have been conducting my own investigation, cousin," Edmund began, his tone maddeningly pleasant, "into the character of your new companion and her family history. I fear what I have uncovered will disappoint you greatly." He opened the folder and produced several documents, spreading them across the table with practiced showmanship. Elena's stomach dropped as she recognized forged versions of the very ledgers Nathaniel had shown her weeks earlier, except now the details had been subtly altered, painting her father not as a wrongly accused victim, but as a genuine embezzler who had confessed privately to his crimes before fleeing prosecution through the mercy of the old Duke's compassion. "These are lies," Elena said immediately, her voice sharp despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest. "My father never confessed to anything, because he committed nothing to confess." Edmund's smile did not waver. "I understand this must be difficult to accept," he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy, "but I have witnesses prepared to testify to the truth of these documents, respected men whose word carries weight in this county. I fear, cousin, that your kindness toward Miss Ashworth has been rather severely misplaced." Nathaniel examined the documents with narrowed eyes, his jaw clenched tight with barely restrained anger. "These are forgeries," he said flatly. "Poorly constructed ones at that. The handwriting does not match the genuine ledgers I have already reviewed extensively." Edmund's composure flickered for just a moment, before smoothing back into practiced calm. "Handwriting can be disputed endlessly by those determined to see what they wish to see," he said. "But public opinion, cousin, rarely concerns itself with such fine details. I have already ensured that certain families throughout the county have received copies of these documents. By tomorrow, the story will no longer be one of a wronged steward's daughter, but of a clever schemer who nearly deceived a grieving duke into marrying beneath his station, based entirely on fabricated victimhood." Elena felt the room tilt slightly around her, understanding with sickening clarity exactly what Edmund had done. He had preempted whatever evidence Nathaniel intended to present at the harvest gathering, flooding the county with his own counter-narrative before the truth could ever reach willing ears. Whatever genuine testimony they had gathered would now be dismissed as desperate fabrication in response to Edmund's carefully seeded lies. "You will not get away with this," Nathaniel said, his voice low and dangerous in a way Elena had never heard from him before. Edmund gathered his forged documents back into their leather folder with unhurried precision. "I already have, cousin," he said simply. "The letters have gone out. The damage, I fear, is already done. Perhaps it would be wisest for Miss Ashworth to remove herself quietly from your household before matters grow even more uncomfortable for everyone involved." He left the drawing room without waiting for a response, leaving Elena and Nathaniel alone in stunned, heavy silence. Elena sank into a chair, her hands shaking uncontrollably, the weight of Edmund's calculated cruelty finally breaking through whatever composure she had managed to maintain throughout the confrontation. "He has ruined everything," she whispered. "My father's name, whatever chance we had of restoring it. He has turned the truth itself into something unbelievable." Nathaniel knelt before her, taking her trembling hands in his. "Not everything," he said firmly, though even his voice carried an edge of uncertainty he could not fully disguise. "We still have genuine evidence. We still have witnesses willing to speak the truth, however damaged their credibility now appears in the wake of his lies." But Elena shook her head, exhaustion and despair finally overwhelming the fragile hope she had allowed herself to hold these past weeks. "It will not be enough, Nathaniel," she said. "You saw how quickly he moved, how thoroughly he prepared. He has spent his entire life perfecting this particular cruelty. I cannot ask you to sacrifice your own reputation fighting a battle he has already won through deception and violence." That night, alone in the small cottage with her sleeping father, Elena made a decision that felt both impossible and inevitable. She could not bear the thought of Nathaniel's name being dragged through scandal alongside her own, could not bear watching him lose the respect of his peers over a battle that seemed, despite every effort, destined to end in humiliation rather than vindication. She began packing what little she owned into a worn traveling bag, tears streaming silently down her face as she folded each garment with trembling hands. She left a letter for her father, explaining only that she had found work in a distant town and would send for him once she was settled, unable to bring herself to write the full truth of her departure, knowing he would try to stop her if he understood the real reason behind it. She left before dawn, walking through fields still dark with early morning shadow, her heart breaking with every step that carried her further from Blackwood Hall and everything she had begun to hope for there. Nathaniel discovered her absence hours later, when Mrs. Fenwick arrived at the library to find Elena's usual morning tasks untouched, her coat and bag missing from where they normally hung near the servants' entrance. He rode immediately to her father's cottage, finding the old man frantic with worry over the letter Elena had left behind, its vague explanation offering little comfort to either of them. "She has run," Nathaniel said grimly, reading the letter with growing alarm. "She believes leaving will protect me from further scandal. She does not understand that losing her would be a far greater loss than any damage to my reputation Edmund could ever hope to inflict." Harold Ashworth gripped Nathaniel's arm with surprising strength for a man so weakened by illness. "Find her," he said urgently. "Whatever road she has taken, whatever destination she believes will keep her safely away from harm, you must find her before she disappears entirely into a world that has already taken so much from her." Nathaniel wasted no time. He gathered what men he could spare from the estate, sending them in different directions along the roads leading away from the village, while he himself rode toward the nearest coaching inn, reasoning that Elena, with limited funds and no clear destination, would likely seek the most affordable and immediate means of travel available to her. He found her there 2 hours later, sitting alone on a wooden bench outside the inn, waiting for a coach that would not arrive until midday, her face pale and her eyes red from crying, though she straightened immediately at the sound of approaching hoofbeats, recognizing the rhythm before she even turned to look. Nathaniel dismounted quickly, crossing the distance between them in urgent strides. "Elena," he said, his voice rough with emotion and the exertion of his ride. "What are you doing?" "I am protecting you," she said, though her voice broke on the words, betraying the pain such protection cost her. "From scandal, from ruin, from a battle you should never have taken up on my behalf in the first place." Nathaniel took her face gently in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Do you truly believe I care more for my reputation than I care for you?" he asked softly. "Do you believe I have spent these past weeks fighting for your father's honor simply out of obligation, rather than genuine love for the woman who walked into my library one night and reminded me what it felt like to hope for something again?" Elena's resolve crumbled entirely at his words, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of losing you to a battle we cannot win. Afraid of watching you sacrifice everything for a truth Edmund has already buried beneath his lies." "We have not lost yet," Nathaniel said firmly, "and I refuse to let you carry this burden alone, believing your absence could somehow protect either of us from what Edmund has already set in motion. Come home, Elena. Fight this with me, not instead of me." As Elena finally allowed herself to lean into his embrace, grateful and overwhelmed by the depth of devotion he continued to show her despite every obstacle thrown between them, a rider approached from the direction of Blackwood Hall at considerable speed, waving urgently to catch their attention. It was one of Mrs. Fenwick's nephews, employed as a stable hand at the estate, his face flushed with excitement and urgency. "Your Grace," he called breathlessly as he reined in his horse. "You must return at once. A woman has arrived at the house, claiming to have information about the old scandal, and about Master Edmund's more recent activities as well. She says her name is Margaret Pierce, and that she served as a maid in this household many years ago, present the very night the original false accusations were first constructed." Nathaniel and Elena exchanged a startled glance, hope flickering fragile but unmistakable between them. Elena climbed onto Nathaniel's horse behind him without hesitation, her earlier despair replaced now by cautious, urgent determination, and together they rode back toward Blackwood Hall as quickly as the horse could carry them, uncertain what truth awaited them there, but unwilling any longer to face whatever came without standing firmly together. They found Margaret Pierce waiting in the drawing room, a woman perhaps 60 years of age, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her posture stiff with the particular nervousness of someone unaccustomed to grand houses and important company. Mrs. Fenwick sat beside her, offering quiet reassurance, and rose the moment Nathaniel and Elena entered, relief plain on her face. "She came to me first," Mrs. Fenwick explained. "We served together many years ago, before she left service to marry and settle in the next county. When word reached her of the trouble surrounding Master Ashworth's old dismissal, and of Master Edmund's recent conduct, she felt compelled to finally speak what she has carried silently for so long." Margaret Pierce rose unsteadily to her feet, her eyes finding Elena's face with an expression of sorrowful recognition. "You have your father's eyes," she said softly. "I remember him well. A kind man, always patient with the younger staff, always fair in his dealings with the tenants." "Please," Elena said, moving closer, her voice trembling with barely contained hope. "Tell us what you know." Margaret drew a steadying breath before beginning her account. "I was a young maid in this household the winter your father was dismissed," she said. "I overheard a conversation I was never meant to hear, between Master Edmund and a solicitor he had summoned privately, discussing how best to construct evidence against your father, before the old Duke could investigate too closely. I heard Edmund instruct the solicitor to alter certain receipts, to forge signatures where necessary, all so that the blame for missing tenant funds Edmund himself had quietly diverted for his own purposes, could be shifted entirely onto your father's shoulders." Elena's breath caught, tears gathering once more, though these were different tears than the despair she had carried earlier that morning, tears of vindication finally within reach after years of silent shame. "Why did you never speak of this before?" Nathaniel asked gently, though there was no accusation in his tone, only genuine curiosity. Margaret's expression grew heavy with old regret. "I was young, and frightened," she admitted. "I saw what happened to others who dared question Master Edmund's conduct. A stable hand dismissed without cause, tenants threatened with eviction. I convinced myself my silence protected my own position, my own family's security, and told myself that speaking up would change nothing regardless, that a maid's word would never outweigh a gentleman's denial. I have carried the guilt of that silence for many years, and when I heard that the truth might finally have a chance at seeing daylight, I could not bear to remain quiet any longer." Nathaniel moved quickly to secure her testimony properly, summoning a local magistrate he trusted implicitly, a man known throughout the county for his fairness and resistance to influence from wealthier families. Margaret repeated her account before him in careful detail, providing specific dates and descriptions that aligned precisely with the forged ledgers Nathaniel had already uncovered, strengthening the case against Edmund far beyond what circumstantial evidence alone could have accomplished. With Margaret's testimony added to the growing collection of proof, Nathaniel felt, for the first time since Edmund's devastating counterattack, genuine confidence that the truth could withstand whatever fabrications his cousin continued to spread throughout the county. Yet he knew that testimony and documents alone might not be enough to overcome the damage already done to public perception, not when Edmund had moved so quickly and so thoroughly to poison opinion against Elena and her father, before the truth ever had a chance to reach willing ears. "We need more than evidence," Nathaniel said that evening, pacing before the fire as Elena watched him from her chair, exhaustion finally giving way to cautious hope. "We need a public reckoning, something undeniable enough that even those who have already condemned your father based on Edmund's lies cannot continue to doubt the truth once it stands before them." "The harvest gathering," Elena said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. "The one already planned, where half the county will be present regardless of whatever rumors currently circulate." Nathaniel nodded, determination hardening his expression. "We confront him there, before witnesses too numerous and too respected to be easily dismissed or intimidated into silence afterward. It is sooner than I would have liked, and riskier than a quieter approach might allow, but I believe it is our best chance at ensuring the truth cannot simply be buried beneath more of his carefully constructed lies." Elena felt fear coil once more in her stomach at the thought of such a public confrontation, uncertain what desperate measures Edmund might attempt once cornered before the very society whose good opinion he had spent his entire life carefully cultivating. But she also felt, for the first time in weeks, something steadier beneath that fear, a resolve born of finally having real proof, real witnesses, and Nathaniel standing firmly beside her, rather than simply fighting on her behalf from a careful distance. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, reaching for his hand, "we face it together." Nathaniel squeezed her fingers gently, his expression softening despite the tension still evident in his shoulders. "Together," he agreed, "always, from this point forward." The harvest gathering filled Blackwood Hall's great lawn with more guests than Elena had ever seen assembled in one place, colorful tents and long tables spread across the grass beneath a sky finally clear after weeks of autumn rain, though the beauty of the day did little to settle the nervous tightness in her chest. She stood near the edge of the gathering in a borrowed gown Mrs. Fenwick had insisted she wear, simple but elegant, determined that Elena should stand before the assembled county looking every bit as dignified as the truth she carried deserved. Nathaniel moved through the crowd with careful purpose, greeting guests with practiced composure that Elena knew masked the same coiled tension she felt herself, both of them waiting for the moment they had planned so carefully over the preceding days. Edmund arrived fashionably late, as was his habit, dressed in his finest coat, his smile bright and confident as he moved through the gathering, greeting acquaintances with the same easy charm that had served him so effectively for so many years. Elena watched him from across the lawn, her hands clenched tightly at her sides, and felt Nathaniel's presence settle beside her, steady and reassuring. "It is time," he murmured. Nathaniel raised his voice, calling for the attention of the assembled guests with the natural authority of a man accustomed to command, though Elena could hear the careful control beneath his words, the effort required to keep his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was about to do. "Friends, neighbors," he began, as conversation gradually quieted around the lawn, "I thank you all for joining us today, and I ask your patience for a matter I feel compelled to address before we continue our celebrations. Many of you have received letters in recent weeks concerning Miss Elena Ashworth and her father, letters that painted a picture of deception and scheming I have since discovered to be entirely false." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Elena felt every eye seem to turn toward her at once, though she forced herself to stand tall, refusing to let her fear show. Across the lawn, Edmund's smile had frozen slightly, his eyes sharpening with sudden alertness. "I have spent the past weeks investigating the circumstances surrounding Harold Ashworth's dismissal from this estate many years ago," Nathaniel continued, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent gathering. "I have uncovered forged documents, coerced silence, and deliberate cruelty inflicted upon an innocent man in order to conceal the true culprit behind funds missing from tenant repairs during that period." Edmund stepped forward, his composure cracking visibly now, though he attempted to maintain his usual charming tone. "Cousin," he said, a note of warning creeping into his voice, "this is hardly the venue for such matters. I disagree, Nathaniel said firmly, turning to face him directly before the assembled crowd. I believe this is precisely the venue, given how thoroughly you have already used gatherings such as this one to spread lies about Miss Ashworth's character throughout the county. Nathaniel gestured, and the magistrate who had taken Margaret Pierce's testimony stepped forward from where he had been waiting quietly among the guests, along with Margaret herself, her hands trembling slightly, but her expression resolute as she faced the crowd that had gathered. This is Margaret Pierce, Nathaniel announced. She served in this household during the very period of Harold Ashworth's dismissal, and she has provided sworn testimony describing how Edmund Whitmore personally constructed the false evidence used to destroy an innocent steward's reputation, in order to conceal his own theft of the funds in question. Gasps and murmurs swept through the crowd, and Edmund's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence crumbling rapidly beneath the weight of public exposure he had clearly never anticipated facing so directly. He attempted to speak, to offer some smooth denial or clever redirection, but the words seemed to fail him for perhaps the first time in his carefully constructed life. This is absurd, he finally managed, though his voice lacked its usual persuasive confidence. A servant's word against my own? Surely you cannot expect these good people to believe such an accusation without further proof. I have further proof, Nathaniel said, producing a leather folder of his own, containing the genuine ledgers, the tenant testimonies, and additional documentation his investigators had gathered in recent days. I have witnesses willing to testify under oath before any magistrate you choose to name, cousin. I have evidence that you diverted tenant repair funds for your own personal debts, and constructed an elaborate scheme to shift blame onto a man who served this family with nothing but loyalty and honesty for many years. Edmund's eyes darted across the crowd, searching perhaps for allies who might rally to his defense, but found only uncertain, wary faces staring back at him, the easy charm that had once secured his social standing evaporating rapidly beneath the weight of undeniable evidence presented so publicly and so thoroughly. Several of the county's most respected families exchanged troubled glances, clearly reconsidering whatever loyalty they had previously extended to him. I also have proof, Nathaniel continued, his voice hardening further, that you recently attempted to silence a witness through violence, an assault on an elderly tenant named Walter Higgins, who was fortunate enough to survive the attack, though badly shaken by it. I have already alerted the proper authorities to investigate this matter fully, and I expect they will find your involvement as thoroughly documented as everything else you have attempted to conceal. This final revelation broke whatever remained of Edmund's composure entirely. His face contorted with a mixture of fury and desperation, and for a moment Elena feared he might attempt something rash, might lash out physically against Nathaniel in a last desperate bid to salvage his crumbling position. But instead, he simply stood frozen for a long, terrible moment, the weight of public exposure finally settling fully upon him, before turning and pushing his way through the stunned crowd, abandoning the gathering entirely rather than face further humiliation. The magistrate signaled quietly to several men positioned discreetly near the edges of the lawn, who moved to follow Edmund's hasty departure, ensuring he would not simply disappear before facing the formal consequences of his actions. The crowd remained in stunned silence for several long moments after his departure, before murmurs began building once more, this time filled with sympathy and support rather than the suspicion and judgment that had colored earlier weeks. Elena felt tears gathering as she watched years of carefully constructed lies finally crumble in the space of a single afternoon, watched the faces around her shift from doubt to genuine sorrow for everything her family had endured. Nathaniel turned to her, extending his hand before the entire assembled county, a gesture far more significant than a simple offer of comfort. Miss Ashworth, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the lawn once more, though now filled with warmth rather than the careful formality he had maintained throughout the confrontation. I believe your father's name deserves to be spoken with the honor it was always owed. I intend to see it fully restored, publicly and permanently, beginning today. Elena took his hand, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment, by the weight finally lifting from shoulders that had carried shame and fear for so many years. Around them, the gathered guests began to applaud, tentatively at first, then with growing warmth as the truth of everything they had witnessed settled fully into understanding. In the days that followed, Edmund Whitmore was formally charged with fraud, forgery, and assault, his once secure position within respectable society collapsing entirely beneath the weight of evidence too thorough to dispute. He was stripped of whatever remaining influence he had held over Blackwood Hall's affairs, and though the full legal proceedings would take considerable time to resolve completely, there was no longer any question throughout the county regarding the truth of what he had done, both to Harold Ashworth many years earlier, and to Elena in his desperate attempts to protect his secrets more recently. Harold Ashworth, weakened by illness but strengthened immeasurably by the restoration of his good name, was formally welcomed back to Blackwood Hall as an honored guest, his years of quiet suffering finally acknowledged before the very society that had once condemned him without cause. Nathaniel personally ensured that any remaining debts accumulated during those difficult years were settled, and offered Harold a comfortable cottage on the estate grounds, close enough that Elena could care for him easily, while continuing whatever role she chose to play within the household going forward. One quiet evening, several weeks after the harvest gathering had transformed everything Elena believed possible for her future, Nathaniel led her into the library, where their story had first begun. The same tall shelves and warm firelight that had witnessed her frightened trespass, now witnessing something entirely different. He carried with him the small book of poetry that had started everything, his mother's handwriting still visible in the margins where Elena had first noticed it that fateful night. "I never told you the full truth about this book," Nathaniel said softly, settling into the chair beside her near the fire. "My mother did not simply give it to your father as a gift for his service. She wrote something inside it, something meant for him specifically, that I only discovered recently while searching through her private papers." He opened the book carefully to a page near the back, revealing a folded letter tucked into the binding, yellowed slightly with age but perfectly preserved. Elena took it with trembling hands, unfolding it carefully to find her father's name written across the top in handwriting she now recognized as belonging to the late Duchess. "Read it," Nathaniel encouraged gently. Elena's eyes filled with tears as she read the letter, a heartfelt message from Nathaniel's mother to her father, thanking him for his years of loyal service, expressing genuine friendship that had clearly grown between them despite the difference in their stations, and promising that should he ever face difficulty, the Blackwood family would stand ready to help him as he had so often helped others throughout his years of service. "She wrote this shortly before the accusations began," Nathaniel explained quietly. "I believe she may have sensed some coming trouble, though she passed before she could ever act on whatever concerns she held. This letter was never delivered, lost among her private papers until I finally found it while searching for answers about your father's dismissal." Elena pressed the letter gently to her chest, overwhelmed by the unexpected gift of finally understanding the genuine friendship that had once existed between her father and Nathaniel's mother, a friendship that had, in its own quiet way, ultimately led her back to this very library so many years later. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding this, for everything you have done to restore what was taken from my family." Nathaniel reached for her hand, his expression growing suddenly serious in a way that made Elena's heart quicken with anticipation. "There is something else I wish to give you," he said, reaching into his coat and producing a small velvet box that he opened carefully to reveal a delicate ring, simple but beautifully crafted, catching the firelight with a soft, warm glow. "Elena," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident beneath it, "from the moment I found you asleep in this library with my mother's book against your heart, I felt something shift within me that I did not fully understand until these past weeks taught me exactly what it meant. I love you, not out of guilt for what my family's name allowed to happen to yours, but because you have shown me courage and grace and genuine goodness through every difficulty we have faced together. I would be honored if you would agree to become my wife." Elena's tears fell freely now, joy overwhelming every lingering fear that had once made such happiness feel impossible to imagine. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion as Nathaniel slid the ring gently onto her finger. "Yes, I will marry you." He drew her into his arms, and as their lips met in a kiss far more certain and unguarded than the first they had shared in this very room, Elena felt the last remnants of old shame and fear dissolve entirely, replaced by a happiness she had never quite believed herself worthy of claiming. Outside the tall windows, autumn had begun giving way to the first quiet promise of winter, but within the walls of the library that had first brought them together, something warm and lasting had finally taken root, strong enough to carry them both toward whatever future awaited beyond the sorrows of the past. Elena hurried home that evening with the ring catching moonlight on her finger, scarcely able to contain the joy bubbling within her chest, and found her father sitting by the fire exactly where she had left him hours earlier. He looked up as she entered, and whatever composure she had hoped to maintain crumbled the moment their eyes met, the truth of her happiness written plainly across her tear-streaked face. "He asked you," her father said softly, though it was hardly a question at all. Elena knelt beside his chair and showed him the ring, unable to speak through the fresh tears gathering in her eyes. Her father took her hand gently, examining the delicate band with careful attention, before pulling her into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could have managed. Your mother would have loved him, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. She always believed that true kindness reveals itself most clearly in difficult moments, and I have watched this young man prove that kindness again and again these past months, through every obstacle his own cousin placed before you both. They sat together late into the night, speaking of the wedding to come, of the future that suddenly seemed brighter and more certain than either of them had dared imagine only weeks earlier. Harold Ashworth, though still weakened by lingering illness, seemed to draw new strength from the joy surrounding him, his laughter returning more easily than it had in years. The shadow of old disgrace finally lifted entirely from his shoulders. News of the engagement spread quickly through the county, carried this time not by cruel rumor but by genuine celebration, as neighbors who had once doubted Elena's character now welcomed her warmly, eager to make amends for whatever unkindness they had shown while believing Edmund's carefully constructed lies. Mrs. Fenwick wept openly when Elena shared the news, embracing her with the warmth of someone who had watched the entire story unfold from its very beginning, and had never once doubted where it would eventually lead. The wedding itself, held the following spring in the same garden where the harvest gathering had once witnessed Edmund's public downfall, brought together the entire county in celebration rather than scandal. Harold Ashworth, dressed in a fine new coat Nathaniel had insisted on providing, walked his daughter down a flower-lined path with tears of pride streaming freely down his weathered face, finally able to witness his daughter's happiness without the weight of old shame darkening the occasion. Margaret Pierce attended as an honored guest, her courage in finally speaking the truth publicly celebrated rather than forgotten, and the elderly tenant Walter Higgins, fully recovered from his injuries, stood among the witnesses who had helped bring justice to a wrong committed decades earlier. Edmund Whitmore's name was spoken by no one that day, his absence from the celebration a quiet testament to how thoroughly justice had finally caught up with cruelty long left unchecked. As Elena and Nathaniel exchanged their vows beneath a sky as clear and bright as the promise they made to one another, Elena found her thoughts drifting briefly to that first frightened night in the library, to the small book of poetry that had somehow carried her from shame and poverty toward a happiness she had never believed herself worthy of claiming. She thought of Nathaniel's mother, whose kindness toward her father decades earlier had planted the seeds of everything that eventually blossomed between them, and she silently thanked whatever quiet fate had guided her through that library door on a rainy night that now felt like the beginning of an entirely different life. The library itself remained, in the years that followed, Elena's favorite room within Blackwood Hall, its shelves eventually filled with new volumes alongside the old, its quiet corners witness to countless evenings spent together long after the excitement of their courtship had settled into the deeper, steadier contentment of a marriage built upon honesty, courage, and a love strong enough to overcome even the darkest inheritance of the past. A year after the wedding, a letter arrived at Blackwood Hall bearing a seal Elena did not recognize, and something in the careful, formal handwriting across the front made her hesitate before opening it, an old unease stirring despite the peaceful life she had built in the months since Edmund's downfall. Nathaniel found her standing in the entrance hall, the unopened letter still in her hands, and gently took it from her, breaking the seal himself before she could voice her hesitation aloud. He scanned the contents quickly, his expression shifting from wariness to something closer to grim satisfaction. "It is from the magistrate's office," he said. "Edmund's trial has concluded. He has been found guilty on all charges, fraud, forgery, and assault, and sentenced to transportation. His estate holdings seized to compensate those he wronged, including a formal payment ordered directly to your father for the years of hardship caused by his false accusations." Elena felt a complicated mixture of relief and lingering sorrow wash over her. Relief that justice had finally been served completely. Sorrow for the family connection that had been so thoroughly and permanently severed by one man's greed and cruelty. She had not wished harm upon Edmund, only truth, only the restoration of her father's good name, yet she could not deny the peace that settled over her upon learning that he could no longer threaten anyone else as he had once threatened her family, and, more recently, herself. Her father received the news with quiet dignity when Nathaniel and Elena shared it with him later that same afternoon, sitting comfortably now in the cottage on the estate grounds where his health had steadily improved under the care and security their new life provided. He listened carefully to the details of the settlement, and when they finished, he simply nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "I take no joy in another man's downfall," he said quietly, "even one who caused our family such suffering. But I confess I feel a peace I have not known in many years, knowing the truth finally stands unquestioned, and that no other family will suffer as we once did at his hands." Life at Blackwood Hall settled into a rhythm of quiet contentment in the months that followed. Elena continued her work within the library, though now as its mistress rather than its assistant, gradually transforming the once disorganized collection into a resource admired throughout the county, welcoming scholars and curious neighbors alike to explore its carefully catalogued shelves. Nathaniel, freed from the shadow of his cousin's ambitions and the uncertainty that had once clouded his family's affairs, threw himself into improving the estate's management, ensuring that tenants received fair treatment and that the mistakes of the past, born from unchecked greed and unquestioned authority, would never again take root within Blackwood's borders. Mrs. Fenwick remained a steady presence throughout the household, her affection for Elena growing deeper with each passing season, and she often remarked, with a knowing smile, that she had suspected from the very first morning she found Elena waiting nervously outside the library doors that something significant had already begun taking shape between the Duke and his unexpected visitor. One autumn evening, nearly 2 years after that first fateful night when Elena had slipped into the library seeking only to return a borrowed book, she sat in her favorite chair near the fire, one hand resting gently against the gentle curve of her stomach, watching Nathaniel work quietly at his desk across the room. He looked up, catching her gaze, and smiled with the particular warmth that had become so familiar to her over their years together. "You are thinking of that first night again," he said, setting down his quill and crossing the room to join her by the fire. Elena smiled, not surprised that he had read her thoughts so easily after so much time spent together. "I was thinking of how frightened I was," she admitted. "How certain I felt that discovery would ruin everything, when in truth it was only the beginning of everything good that followed." Nathaniel settled into the chair beside her, reaching for her hand and pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles. "I remember standing in that doorway, seeing you asleep with my mother's book against your chest," he said softly. "I felt something shift within me even then, though I did not understand it fully until much later. I believe, in some strange way, my mother led you to that room that night, knowing somehow that you would bring exactly the kind of courage and warmth this house had been missing since her passing." Elena leaned into his shoulder, comforted by the familiar steadiness of his presence, and thought of her father, now fully recovered and spending his days happily tending a small garden near his cottage, his laughter frequently carrying across the grounds as he shared stories with the household staff who had come to adore him. She thought of Margaret Pierce, who visited occasionally now, always welcomed warmly, her courage never forgotten by the family whose fortunes she had helped restore. She thought of Walter Higgins, fully recovered and living comfortably, grateful witness to a justice he had once feared he might not live to see fulfilled. And she thought, most of all, of the small book of poetry that had started everything, still kept carefully in its place on the library shelf, its worn pages and faded handwriting, a permanent reminder of the friendship between her father and Nathaniel's mother that had, against every obstacle placed before it, ultimately led two grieving hearts toward a love neither had believed themselves capable of finding again. "Do you ever wonder," Elena asked quietly, "what might have happened if I had simply left the book on the doorstep that night, rather than slipping inside to return it properly?" Nathaniel considered the question with genuine thoughtfulness before answering. "I believe we would have found our way to each other regardless," he said finally. "Perhaps not that same night, perhaps not in quite the same manner, but I believe some things are simply meant to unfold as they should, however winding or difficult the path toward them may prove. You were always going to walk into my life, Elena, whether through a library door at midnight or some other means entirely. I am only grateful it happened exactly as it did, for it brought us here, to this quiet evening, to this life we have built together." Elena smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as the fire crackled softly beside them, the same fire that had once illuminated a frightened trespasser clutching a borrowed book, now warming a home filled with genuine love, restored honor, and the quiet promise of a family soon to grow beyond just the two of them. Outside, the first snow of the season began drifting gently past the tall library windows, settling softly over the grounds of Blackwood Hall, a peaceful winter descending upon a house that had finally, after so many years of hidden grief and buried scandal, found its way toward lasting happiness. Spring arrived gently that year, bringing with it the birth of their first child, a daughter with her mother's steady gaze and her father's quiet thoughtfulness, born in the very room where Nathaniel himself had come into the world decades earlier. Harold Ashworth wept openly when he first held his granddaughter, his weathered hands trembling with joy rather than illness, and declared, to the amusement of the entire household, that she would grow up surrounded by books, just as her mother had, though hopefully without the need to slip through library doors under cover of darkness to find her place among them. They named her Margaret, in quiet honor of both Nathaniel's late mother and the courageous woman whose long-delayed testimony had finally restored justice to their family. Mrs. Fenwick took to the role of doting caretaker immediately, insisting on personally overseeing the nursery's preparations, and Elena often found her humming softly to the infant during quiet afternoons, stories of the household's long history spilling gently from her lips as though passing down memory itself to the newest generation. The library, once a place of secrets and quiet shame, gradually transformed into the heart of family life at Blackwood Hall. Elena began a tradition of reading aloud there each evening, first simply for her own pleasure, then later for her growing daughter, who would sit contentedly upon her lap listening to stories long before she could understand the words themselves. Nathaniel often joined them, setting aside estate business to listen as his wife's voice filled the same room where their story had first begun, the tall shelves now holding not only ancient volumes of poetry and history, but new editions Elena had carefully selected herself, symbols of a collection no longer frozen in grief, but actively growing alongside the family that tended it. Word of their story spread beyond the county over the following years, whispered admiringly among families who had once doubted Elena's character, now held up as an example of how truth and courage could triumph even against carefully constructed deception. Young women in similarly difficult circumstances sometimes wrote to Elena, having heard some version of her story secondhand, seeking encouragement or guidance, and she made a quiet practice of answering each letter personally, offering what comfort and wisdom she could to those facing their own battles against injustice and doubt. Harold Ashworth lived many more peaceful years than his early illness had once seemed to promise, his health steadily strengthened by security, purpose, and the joy of watching his daughter's happiness unfold alongside his growing collection of grandchildren. For Margaret was soon followed by a son, named Edward after no one in particular, simply because Elena and Nathaniel both liked the sound of it, unburdened by any connection to the painful history that had once nearly destroyed everything they eventually built together. On quiet evenings, long after the children had been settled into bed and the household had grown still around them, Elena and Nathaniel often found themselves back in the library, the place that had witnessed every significant turn of their story, from frightened trespass to devastating scandal, to hard-won justice, and finally to lasting, contented love. They would sit together near the fire, sometimes reading, sometimes simply talking, occasionally falling into comfortable silence that needed no words to feel complete. "I used to believe," Elena said one such evening, years after their wedding, "that discovery in this room would be the worst thing that ever happened to me. Now I cannot imagine my life without that night, without you finding me here." Nathaniel reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers with the easy familiarity of years spent together. "Nor can I imagine mine," he said softly. "Whatever pain led us both to this room that night, I have never once regretted where it eventually carried us." Outside, stars gathered slowly across the darkening sky above Blackwood Hall, the same sky that had once witnessed a frightened young woman hurrying home through midnight rain, now watching over a home filled with laughter, security, and a love that had proven strong enough to outlast every attempt made to destroy it. Within the library's warm glow, surrounded by books old and new, by memories both painful and joyful, Elena and Nathaniel remained exactly where they belonged, together, grateful, and finally, completely at peace.